Hey there, and welcome to this behind-the-scenes mock interview, where I'll be interviewing myself on the topic of an analytical question. In this interview, we'll be discussing A/B testing, and there's a helpful guide in the course for how to go about these problems, so be sure to read it after this video if you haven't already. Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, but just keep in mind that this is not a rehearsed question. I'm intentionally doing these unrehearsed so you can get a behind-the-scenes look of exactly how you might go about answering this question. Thank you for that, but I have a few questions to start off with before we jump into the problem. My first question is, what currently is the behavior with the blue dot? Could you tell me a little bit more about what exactly goes on? The interviewer responds saying that the blue dot, currently what it does is it tries to find your location, shows a radius that shows the error bounds of where you could be based on the GPS, and it will try to narrow that error bound down until it reaches the blue dot. This can take a variable amount of time, and it's hard to predict how much time it will take or how precise it will be given any moment. So there's a lot of uncertainty involved here. Great. My second question to the interviewer is what sorts of feedback reports are we getting, and what kind of use case are we really talking about here? It seems like we're kind of talking about the use case where a user opens their phone, looks at their map, and is trying to figure out where they are on the GPS. It seems like this user is not someone who is navigating somewhere right now, for example, or it's not someone who is looking up a restaurant or anything like that. Is it correct to assume that the function that we can focus on in this interview is focusing solely on the use case where a user opens their phone and they want to pinpoint their GPS? Great. The interviewer responds that this is true, that I can make that assumption fairly. And then my last question is, can we ignore the cases where GPS is simply not available or users are not able to access their GPS, as this may be a frustrating experience, but a rightfully so one, and one that we would assume that Google will not be blamed for any kind of problem? The interviewer says that I can make that assumption. Awesome. Well, I'm going to take a few moments to outline 3 A/B tests that I think are impactful, and then we can walk through each of those 3 and then maybe pick the one that we think is the best. Just give me a few moments. Great. Thank you for giving me the time. I have 3 A/B tests that I'd like to run that I think are pretty impactful for this product. So the first one, and I'll walk through kind of a general framework for each of these, but the first one relies on the hypothesis that the user is frustrated because the user is not informed. The user doesn't know what's going on under the hood. And the more that we can tell the user what's going on, the better. It's kind of like a loading screen that spins infinitely in a circle versus a loading screen that has a bar that has a clear beginning and end. The latter one, the one that has a clear beginning and end, is much better for the user frustration aspect of things. So in this case, what I'd imagine, the kind of methodology here is something like this. So so this is kind of your normal Google Maps experience, but then at the bottom of the screen, we can have text that kind of tells the user what's going on under the hood. I'm imagining some of the text things could be searching for GPS signal. Even that might actually vastly improve the experience because we're telling the user what's going on. We can also tell the user when we've given up or when we can't get the signal, and we can tell the user other things like currently reducing radius or reducing radius by 500 feet. This added information will add so much more comfort to the user, since the user will be able to actually understand what's going on under the hood and be like, okay, I understand. Google needs to do this thing for a moment. And where possible, it can give timestamps, but I know that you said that it's really hard to predict. And we would frustrate a user a lot more if we said something lower than it actually was. So let's stay away from timestamps, but at least just give a sense of what the algorithm is doing in any given moment. I think this would vastly improve the experience. The metrics that I'd want to look for to validate whether or not this is actually a successful experience. I would imagine that the number of kind of like taps or kind of frustrated clicks, and we can probably measure those based on patterns that we use at Google otherwise. So I would say the number of frustrated interactions with that user, so kind of like repeated actions, if the user keeps tapping the same spot, or if the user shakes their phone, or if the user turns off their phone and on again, all of these things can be kind of bundled into a frustrated user action. So I would like to track the number of frustrated user actions here. I would also like to track the deviation in if the user moves location. So I know one thing that users do a lot when they're frustrated with their GPS is that they move, they physically walk somewhere else. So I would like to evaluate the deviation in how many feet is moved per user, given that they see the screen or not. So if they don't see this, if they do see this little box at the bottom, I would predict that they move less. That would be my prediction there. That they are, okay, Google's waiting, let me just wait in this spot until it's figured out. So less movement per user. Great. And then the third metric that I would look at, just to check and make sure everything's okay, I would check the general Google Maps statistics on navigation, opens, all that sort of thing. So is that user using our product less or more as a result of this experience? And these would rely on really, really large numbers. So I'm just going to put healthy kind of user metrics here. So healthy user metrics, kind of like these vital signs of the user. How are they deviating as a result of this change? Are they increasing or decreasing? My hypothesis, given that I think that this is a good experiment, is that we'll reduce the number of frustrated user interactions. We will increase the amount of healthy user metrics, so we'll get more daily active users and more retained users. And we will also have less physical movement on the part of the user when they encounter this screen or some kind of GPS screen. So those are my three predictions and three metrics that I would look at. So I think in terms of what these metrics, so if those metrics were all true or all positive, this would be a great experiment to launch potentially. If these experiments, if let's say we see that one of these bumps up and some of them don't, I would say that we should prioritize the healthy user metrics. Frustrated user interactions are a little hard to totally pin down and totally use. If they really spike, we should definitely drop it. But if they go up or down, it's a little unclear. And the movement, same with the movement per user. So the most vital sign here, I would say, are these healthy user metrics. So retention metrics, activation metrics are users opening this app and using this app as much as they used to, or as much as the control experiment is. This is a really important one. I'm imagining just kind of a 10%, 90%, 10% of the users get our new experience, 90% of the users stay, so we can evaluate that control. Okay, great. So that's kind of the first experiment. I'll call that the informed user experiment. The second experiment I'd like to evaluate is asking the user to move. So we can't actually improve the algorithm, and I know that moving may or may not actually fix the problem, but anecdotally, a lot of users actually do move to fix this problem. They will walk around or they'll try to find a direction, and sometimes it'll help a little bit with figuring out what direction they're pointed. So what if we just make that a part of the user experience? So if we're having a problem, let's say we have over a 5-second timeout with the blue dot, we can just have a dialog screen at the bottom that says, hey, move 1 block, or move in in a certain direction, 20 feet. And not only will it give the user something to do so that they feel like they're kind of helping this problem, anecdotally a lot of users do feel like it helps. So just to give you a sample of what that screen looks like again. And this is a really simple diagram. We're just putting on here, hey, move a little bit. And this would be the normal Google Maps experience. We would be using a similar UI affordance as the previous example, where we would just show something at the bottom and kind of help users out that way. What I would like to do is, the methodology is really similar here. It's after a 5-second timeout, we show this dialog that says, hey, move 20 feet. And after we detect they've moved, we can make that box go away and still show the loading screen. What I would like to do in terms of evaluating this metric, again, I think frustrated user interactions, I think healthy user metrics, again, we should definitely be watching these. I think in this case, we want to see movement. We want to see physical movement on the part of the user. Is the user moving from one spot to another? Is the user moving 20 feet as we tell them to or not? So that's good. And then, I would also try to evaluate, if these users, like out of the users that move, are we seeing different metrics here? So given a moving user, do we see fewer app closes, better retention, fewer feedback reports, etc. So basically what I'm trying to get at here is that we will not only have a distinction between our control, 90% control, and our 10% experiment, but we'll also have some percentage of users that actually move, according to this experience. And I would like to evaluate, given a moving user, do we see kind of fewer of these frustrated interactions and better retention on our platform? I think it's important to look at that segment and really evaluate it. If that is good, if that's improving, then we can actually do a much better job with messaging that to users and getting the word out there about that. The last thing that I really think is important to measure is if our GPS is better or finds it faster. So if moving actually helps the GPS, which we can run via this huge experiment, we should totally consider doing this. And that's a really important factor, actually, is does moving actually help the GPS? So that would be a key insight that I'd like to look for. The impact of this is that clearly if we find a positive metrics on the moving users or if our GPS is faster, we should absolutely ramp up this experiment to full launch because it could really help. One thing that I fear with this launch that I think is really important to mention is that, users may be really confused and frustrated that Google is asking them to move. Even if they do move and it shows positive on our metrics, their brand reputation and their trust of Google may actually decrease because it's like, why is Google asking us to move? Shouldn't Google know that? So I would really carefully look at the Google trust, maybe send out some surveys to our users that ask them like how they feel about Google's trust and Google's prowess as a technology platform, because this could be kind of a step down for Google in some ways. So it's really important to evaluate that qualitative trade-off there. Great. The last experiment that I'd like to evaluate is actually kind of a fun one. So this would be an A/B test that involves delight. And the core hypothesis here is that users who are frustrated and there's nothing to do, maybe they just need something delightful, a delightful experience. An example of this is the lovely Chrome dinosaur. When a user is connected to the internet on Chrome, there's a dinosaur game that you can play just by hitting the space bar. What if we had something like that when the blue dot was appearing? So here's a very crude, and I'm not a designer, so here's a very crude diagram of something maybe like a smiley face in that blue dot, or things like that. The reason I wouldn't actually go with a smiley face is we have to consider that users could be in a very tough situation here. They might be in an emergency looking for a GPS signal, and a smiley face that mockingly looks at them could really make them frustrated and kind of upset. So we don't want to necessarily go forward with that smiley face, but that just gives a sense of what I'm kind of thinking about here. So again, what I'm thinking about here is how can we improve the user delight of this experience? How can we make this a delightful product experience? And what I would imagine is that there's a blue dot, and maybe after 5 seconds, something kind of appears. Maybe a symbol or a little logo, and when you click that, you can play Pong with that blue dot, or you can play some kind of like ball game where you can interact with that blue dot, play a little game. That blue dot is still there, so we still have that brand identity and logo kind of there. It's playing around, and it sort of even seems like a loading screen, right? Like a little Pong game would seem like it's kind of loading, and that game would slowly end after. We would want to pick some game that's kind of silly and fun, like maybe even just tapping the blue dot where it appears on the screen, because users might lose their progress or something, and they might get frustrated again because they just lost that. But I think this could be a really great idea, and I think user delight is a really important principle to keep in mind in product design. So I would love to run some sort of game experiment. The way I would imagine this is that we get an engineer and a designer to design a game that they think is really fun and exciting, and then we kind of test out that game on our own system first, and then we test out some sort of very simple A/B test of a little game or interactivity on our actual platform. If we're actually testing this live and we really want to take a small step forward, let's just do something where you can tap the blue dot and it changes colors. That might be a really simple one. And it might be kind of fun for the users to test their engagement and their fun with that. And maybe the blue dot kind of shifts a little bit as you do that and moves around in a little circle. So let's go with that as kind of a very simple proof of concept to see if users are interested in this. And just change color and kind of have that little fun experience. So great, let's say we were going to go through with that, but then what's our metrics again? So our metrics are engagement on that game. So are users clicking it? Are they continuing to click it? Once they discover that feature, do they get engaged? Do they keep clicking it? User frustration metrics, as we defined earlier, and vital sign metrics, as we defined earlier. Again, we want to look, what we're going to want to look for is, given engagement with that box, do we see user frustration or do we see the vital signs? So how does that appear? One thing that to be really careful is, depending on how we make the game, it might seem like an interaction with our game, but it actually might just be a frustrating user experience if they are trying to click that thing and it doesn't like help their GPS, So we want to make sure that we construct that game or that experiment really carefully to avoid any confusion about what is going on there, and we can set up surveys too to ask about it as well if that helps. One thing to also watch out for with this experiment is that there are long-term and short-term metrics. So maybe users first discover this feature, they think it's kind of cool, and then they get bored of it and they never interact with it again. So we'd want to check a little bit of our long-term metrics. I'd love to run this experiment for about a month to really check and make sure. Great. So those are kind of the metrics that I would look at here. If we are seeing, given engagement, lower user frustration and higher user retention signs, I would like to ramp up this experiment. But not only would I like to ramp up the experiment, I would like to go back and redesign that game and make that game even better, so that we can launch something that we're really proud of when that happens. We should also definitely learn from Chrome and what Chrome has done there in that space. And maybe we can borrow that dinosaur logo and dinosaur identity in the Google Maps experience to kind of connect those two across each other. Great. One trade-off that I'm a little worried about with this experiment, of course, is that thing that I kind of alluded to earlier about mocking or kind of, these can be very dire situations if a user is lost or stuck in the middle of nowhere, and a game or kind of a light experience could actually be really frustrating to a user. Even if it's a small percentage of users, we should really be watching out for that percentage of users and making sure that they're getting a good experience, not just throwing their phone at the wall. So I would really want to carefully launch this experiment, carefully look at the survey data that we send out and see if there are a few minority but vocal users that are very, very upset at this experience or feel like it's very rude or the wrong timing. So I'd really watch out for that. That's a qualitative metric that I would watch out for. Okay, cool. So we've kind of discussed 3 experiments: informing the user, asking the user to move, and user delight. You can see all of them right here on this page. If I were on the whiteboard, I would draw on the whiteboard. But based on this, I really actually like the user delight feature. I think user delight is an important principle. It's been successful in Google Chrome. I know I mentioned some concerns about being rude to the user, but the Google Chrome experience has a similar problem. And I think that it's a really simple change that doesn't ask too much of its user. Asking the user to move could involve a lot of problems. What if the user can't move, or what if there's some kind of issue there with moving, and then they have to go back to the same spot? Or with informing the user, while I think it's great, it seems like we don't quite have enough information on our own side to really provide a useful context to that user. So I would like the 3rd experiment, the user delight experiment, and I would go forward with that if I had to pick an A/B testing experiment. Hopefully this was a helpful exercise for you. This gave you a sense of A/B testing. Generally, I thought my question went pretty well. I noticed I didn't go through exactly the framework for each of those questions. It's totally okay. I would say you can be even more flexible than I was in this question. When you go through it, you don't have to be as tight kind of going through these metrics and stuff. I would say that one helpful thing I could have done better probably is really hone in on those vital signs and what those look like. Because it was kind of hand-waving over them, and it would have been helpful to really pinpoint down or spend a little bit of extra time thinking about those metrics. And I could have paused throughout it to kind of think about that during the question. Great, well, I hope that was helpful. That's all I have on that question, and good luck with the analytical questions.